endlessly searching for an original sin.
Hey guys, welcome back to more Sweet Pool. It's so sweet, isn't it? Oh, but it really, really hasn't been. Xenia had been held up in his room ever since he'd gotten home from school. Whenever Katani put his ear to the door, he could hear the boy muttering to himself. As for Kunihito, he'd gone down to the underground chapel and yet to come out. As he watched the smoke rise, Katani reflected on his miserable morning. Yesterday, they'd kidnapped Shiranuma Tetsuo on his way home, just as Xenia's plan had dictated. That had been an unpleasant experience, although Katani would never refuse an order. Beating up kids was not something he enjoyed. Then he remembered Sakayama Yuji, and how he'd passed out halfway through the ordeal in the shed. The sight of him all roughed up had turned Katani's stomach. He would have preferred to carry the boy all the way back to his apartment, but he couldn't risk being seen. Instead, Katani had been forced to leave him in the trash dump nearby. At one point, he'd asked Xenia if he worried they might report the assault, but the younger Okinaga had laughed it off. Those two, not a chance. A sigh left his lips as a cloud of smoke. Back in the gang, he'd done plenty of things to be ashamed of, but Katani's policy had been never to harm the innocent, especially women and kids. That was still true now that he'd left the life behind. No matter how much he told himself he had been doing his job, it weighed on him. Still, that Shiranuma Tetsuo was something else. No matter how hard Katani had punched him, he barely even blinked. It had felt like years before he passed out from the tranquilizer shot. Honestly, Tetsuo had held out longer than most gangsters would. The memory of that stony gaze still lingered in Katani's mind. There was a dark light behind those eyes. It was the kind of look that chilled you to the bone. He'd seen Tetsuo walk by a few times before while waiting outside the school gates for Xenia. His aura was so unlike the other students that Katani had found his eyes drawn to him. For some reason, it felt like he'd met Tetsuo before, but he couldn't quite place where. Maybe his brain was mixing him up with someone else. Exhaling another cloud of smoke, Katani glanced up at the clock again. Perhaps it was time to go check on Kunihito. He put his cigarette in the ashtray and left the dining room and walked down the hall. He descended the staircase, then gingerly opened the old, faded door to the chapel. He could hear the older man praying inside. Katani pressed his back against the wall and closed his eyes. He didn't have to actually see Kunihito to know that he was doing. Day in and day out, it was the same thing. Beneath the flickering candlelight, Kunihito would face the altar and pray.
どうか怒りをお鎮めください。どうかお願いします。どうか。
But today, something was off. Katani opened his eyes. Normally, Kunihito's prayers bordered on hysteria, but this time his voice was a little more than a whisper. Katani peeked into the chapel, and a shiver shot down his spine. Kunihito was holding something up to the altar. It looked like a furry lump, about the size of a cat or a small dog. Was it some kind of animal? Whatever it was dripping. No. Could Kunihito have killed it? But why? He knew the answer. It was an offering.
あなた方の恨み、この私が決して忘れはしません。キャツに否定されて、あなた方は人の形を取ることすら許されなかった。さぞ 我らを憎んでいることでしょう。ですが、どうか怒りをお鎮めください。どうか。
With his eyes wide and his mouth gaping, he looked like a demon in the candlelight. Something hot and heavy rose in Kitani's chest. Was it too late? Was there no going back to how things had been, to the old Konohito, a powerful leader who commanded the loyalty of countless men? Just then, Konohito glanced over his shoulder. He must have sensed that he wasn't alone. The moment he spotted Kitani watching him, his face contorted with rage.
北に何をぼさっと見ているのだ。
Because you're crazy? He strode up to Kitani and grabbed him by the collar, shaking him so hard he threatened to send them both hoppling to the floor. Caught off guard, Kitani fell to his knees.
お前もひれ伏せ。その不尊を詫びるのだ。神の寵愛を独占し、神の似姿を与えられた己を恥じろ。
Sorry, God. Won't do it again. Sorry for, being created in his image. Kitani was completely incoherent. It sounded like he was angry, not that Kitani had seen, but rather that Kitani hadn't paid his respects. Konohito grabbed the animal corpse off the floor and thrust it in Kitani's face. It was crushed, its original form indiscernible.
貴様もこんな姿になりたいか。こんな姿しか与えられなかったあの方々の無念がわかるのか。
Sorry, God. Disgust gave way to sorrow and pity. He touched Konohito's bloody arm and kept his voice as soft as possible.
親父は何を崇めているのですか。
Before anyone says
こ
it,
こ
it's
には
not
ど
Carl.
んな神が。
Carl doesn't allow animal sacrifice.
神などいない。ここに負わすのは神に見捨てられたる亡霊の念だ。
Spittle flew from Konohito's mouth.
大洪水、ソドムとゴモラ。かつてあまたの人々が無慈悲な神の審判によって命を奪われた。彼らは天国への門を閉ざされたばかりでなく、再び神の似姿を身にまとうことすら許されなかったのだ。
Okay, sorry, God.
その結果がこれだ。彼らは人ならざる姿に身を落としてなお、今も神の子らと嘘吹いてはばからぬ我々を呪い、たたっているのだ。
God likes unicorns. I'm safe.
ああ、ミュルメコレオン。生きることすら許されないからだ。
Once upon a time, Okinaga Konohito had been a devout Christian. He was not a man who showed weakness, and he was never spoken of his beliefs publicly. Only those closest to him had known the truth, that whenever he put his hands together before a meal, it wasn't the gods of Japan to whom he prayed. But though he kept it locked tightly inside his heart, Kitani knew that his faith had been sincere. Wait, isn't the whole thing with Christianity supposed to be you keep it to your heart and sincere and you don't have to go and wave it around publicly? I'm a unicorn, we don't know anything about religion. We're magic. Kitani had never been a believer himself, but Konohito's influence had led him to start reading the Bible in secret. So even without a thorough understanding of the doctrine, Kitani knew enough to be certain of one thing. Whatever beliefs drove Konohito now, they definitely weren't Christian. It had all begun with a single bullet. During a shootout with a rival gang, Kotohino had taken a bullet to the head. The doctor had narrowly managed to save his life, but afterwards, he would often start ranting about evil spirits that no one else could see. Despite this, Kitani had decided to follow Konohito to the bitter end. Konohito was still the man who'd taken him in. If Kitani's loyalty could be shaken so easily, then it would have faltered long ago. He would serve the Okinagas until he took his dying breath. But facts were facts. Konohito was getting worse, and Kitani couldn't pretend that he wasn't concerned about the older man's mental health. He had no intention of leaving. He was just afraid. Afraid of where this was headed.
私には見える。彼らはそこかしこにいる。闇の中から我々を見つめる怨念の眼差しが。
Konohito had returned to his solitary prayers, as though he'd forgotten Kitani's presence. There was no longer any point in being here. His heart heavy, Kitani left Konohito to his delusions. It reeked of gasoline. The air was so hot he could scarcely breathe. His lungs burned every time he tried. Though his blurry vision, he could make out shades of red and black mixed together. It was sweltering. Some part of his body hurt like hell. He wasn't sure which. Something was crushing him. He couldn't move. He could hear what sounded like the wind howling. Then he realized that he was surrounded by flame. The temperature around him was rising. He couldn't breathe. Something exploded nearby. A rumble shook his aching body. Sensing danger, he tried to escape. But when he tried to move whatever was on top of him, his hands touched something slimy. He lowered his gaze to his stomach. The blood-soaked lump of flesh was sitting there. Terrified, he tried to scream, but nothing came out, and yet his throat went raw from the effort. The flesh crawled towards his face, throbbing bloody bubbles from its veiny, membranous surface. He flailed, but his body refused to budge. It was as though he had returned to stone. No! Stay away! No! No! Yuji's eyes snapped open as he woke with a start. Panicked and disorientated, he quickly looked around. He was in his room. At last, reality set in. It had all been a dream. He heaved a sigh of relief. His heart was pounding a mile a minute. Every inch of his body was soaked with sweat. Inhaling slowly to steady his breathing, he reached up with his trembling hand to brush the hair out of his face. He was sure he had just had a nightmare, but for some reason he couldn't remember the details. The images were too fuzzy. They weren't enough to piece together what had taken place. Whatever it had been, it was probably an abstract manifestation of all he had been through over the past few weeks. His body was still plagued with crippling dread, likely a lingering effect of the nightmare, yet somehow he also felt a strange sense of nostalgia. Nostalgic for a nightmare? That couldn't be right. Gradually his heart rate slowed, and he decided to go for a glass of water. But as he got out of bed, his legs gave out. His body pitched sideways, falling toward the aquarium. His hand shot out and grabbed the shelf for support, narrowly managing to keep himself upright. Relieved, Yuji looked down at the aquarium next to him. The water's surface rippled from vibrations, but the fish were still swimming peacefully. They hadn't even noticed. If he hadn't caught himself, he might have knocked the aquarium over, and the fish would have died on the floor. He was the reason they would keep on swimming. Their lives were in his hand. They were at the mercy of a higher power. Could the same be said for Yuji, too? Was his life in another's hands? If so, then whose? Something caught in his chest. His heart ached. Like a lingering trace of his forgotten dream, it stirred in his emotions, sadness and fear. Putting a hand to his forehead, Yuji left the room and headed to the kitchen. After downing a glass of water, Yuji returned to his bedroom and sat down on the sofa. He unplugged his phone from the charger and checked the display. No reply from Erica. Normally, as long as it wasn't too late at night, she would always text or call back quickly. It wasn't like her to take this long. He contemplated giving her a call, but changed his mind once he saw the time. She might already be asleep. Plugging his phone back in, he lay down on the bed. His perspiration had dried, and his shirt felt cold against his back. As he stared up at the ceiling, images floated unbidden through his mind. Shock, confusion, fear, those were normal reactions to having your world upended. With his weak constitution, death had been a specter in Yuji's life for as long as he could remember. But no matter how hard he tried to prepare for any given scenario, reality always outdid his imagination in the worst possible way. The more he thought, the more pessimistic those thoughts became. He rolled over and closed his eyes, and drowsiness soon washed over him. Just then he heard the soft buzzing. It was his phone. He needed to answer it. It could be from Erica. But try as he might to rise, his body was too tired to cooperate. He decided to call her back tomorrow. Yielding to the haze of fatigue, Yuji closed his eyes once more. The next morning, thick gray clouds covered the sky as Yuji headed off to school. It was chilly outside, and the humidity clung to his skin. It would likely rain this afternoon. As he walked to the station, he checked his phone to find a missed call from an unknown number. At this, he furrowed his brow. He assumed the call had been from his sister. However, the explanation quickly came to mind. Maybe it was from her husband? This wouldn't be the first time he had called on her behalf. Yuji debated calling back, but hesitated. His brother-in-law was a good guy, but Yuji barely knew him. Would it be weird for him to call? After giving it some more thought, he decided against it. Speaking with him was awkward enough, as it was. And it wasn't like he urgently needed to talk. Instead, he returned his phone to his book bag. He reached out to Erica again some other time. Thankfully, Yuji's condition remained stable throughout the day, and he was able to focus on his class for once. Makoto must have been feeling bad about yesterday because he didn't come over to talk like he usually did. It was awkward, but Yuji did his best not to think about it as he packed up to go home. Roughly half of his classmates were still in the room, chatting loudly with each other. So loudly, in fact, that Yuji couldn't help but overhear.
そういやさ、聞いた？ B 組のやつが男子トイレで変なもん見たって話。
何それ？
ああ、それ知ってる。科学室で見たとかってやつでしょ？
ちっけえよ。だから男子トイレでさ、血と肉みたいなのが落ちてたとか言ってんの。わけわかんなくね？
Yuji froze in the middle of retrieving his book bag.
何それ？寝ぼけてたんじゃないの？
多分そうっぽい。後で他のやつが確かめに行ったら、そんなもんどこにもなかったんだってさ。
なんかそれって科学室のと一緒じゃん。
それが、キモいのがこっからでさ、ちょうどそのトイレから出てきたのが、沖永前夜でさ、すっごい汗かいて、血だらけで、フラフラになりながら出てったらしいぜ。そしたら、5時を知らせる夕焼け小焼けの鐘が。
それ本当？確かにあの人キモいけどさ。
ほんと、多分ほんと。嘘。よくわかんねえ。
どっちだよ。
The student burst into laughter. But to Yuji, it felt like the words were caving in on him. It would happen again. Another person had witnessed his mess. Why had he just left it there? Regret flooded his chest. Grabbing his book bag, Yuji hurried out of the classroom, desperate to get away from the gossip. He felt lightheaded. The hallway was spinning. The other students all looked like dark shadows. Hey, that's a fun show. He needed to get home. He paused at the lockers to change his shoes, but just as he was about to walk through the front doors... he heard the blood-curdling giggle. Xenia was standing there, leaning against the wall. Begone, thought.
Yochi, mi, ke.
He tilted his head down and grinned up at Yuji. This was the last person Yuji wanted to see. But at the same time, Xenia had information he needed.
さ、ちょっとね。また話したいことがあるんだけど、今からいい？
His first instinct was to tell Xenia to go fuck himself. But was that the smart choice? This could be his chance to find out just how much Xenia knew about his condition. No, not happening. Nothing good came of going with him. Furthermore, something about his behavior struck Yuji as weird. To be fair, Xenia was always weird, but today he was practically well behaved.
ね
Xenia stepped forward, reaching out a hand. But Yuji turned and bolted through the front doors. He couldn't believe He couldn't let Xenia catch him. He needed to run. He headed towards the main gate. He suddenly remembered that his chauffeur usually parked after school. Could he be waiting to ambush him just ahead? In that case, the side exit was the smarter choice. Just then, Yuji heard heavy footsteps behind him. Was it Xenia? The side gates were just past the dumpster area. Without even pausing to glance over his shoulder, Yuji veered toward the dumpsters. The sky was dark, as though night had already fallen, and it was starting to rain. No one else was outside in this weather. Almost there, but just as he ran past the dumpsters, something heavy smashed into him from behind. The impact sent him stumbling forward, but he managed to keep his balance.
捕まえた
A slimy voice whispered in his ear.
話せよ
Xenia was clinging to his back, shoulders heaving. Yuji tried to shake him off. Surprisingly, Xenia let go without complaint. He laughed and shrugged casually.
だってさ、幼稚逃げちゃうんだもん。臆病なクリスチャンみたい。
But Yuji had no intention of talking. He got ready to make another break for it.
逃げなくてもいいのにな。俺と幼稚同じ種類の人間なんだからさ。
The same species. This proved it. Xenia definitely knew something.
幼稚のことは俺がよーくわかってるの。家族よりもね。だからさ、お話ししよ。
Erica's face flashed through Yuji's mind. Was Xenia seriously saying that he knew more about him than she did, even more than Yuji himself? He found this extremely hard to believe, and yet... Balling his hands into a fist, Yuji slowly turned around. Xenia tilted his head and grinned.
よかった。じゃあ、お話しするね。
As the downpour intensified, an electric tension crackled in the air between them. Amid the drumming of the rain, Yuji heard a stiff clacking sound. Xenia was moving one hand at waist height. Was he playing with those dice from before?
俺ね、この前のこといろいろとすごく考えてたんだよね。
Was he referring to the incident with Tetsuo in that room? Yuji didn't want to think about it.
でね、思ったんだよね。もしかしたら、あの時はちょっと失敗しちゃったのかなって。
Messed up.
失敗
そう、失敗。やっぱりね、何かに頼るってのは良くないなって思って。だからね。
The dice fell still. All Yuji could hear now was the rain. Then Zenya's smile widened.
今度はちゃんと自分で調べようと思うんだよね。
Zenya darted forward, his arms outstretched. His thin, pale fingers gripped Yuji's shoulder like a vice.
やめろ、離せよ、この。
楽しいね。
Zenya burst out laughing. At the same time, a strange light burned in his visible eye. Yuji struggled to get away, but his shoes couldn't find traction on the muddy ground.
仲良くしようよ、幼児。俺、お姉ちゃんにも会ってみたいな。
Dude, you are not going near our sister. This distracted him just long enough for Zenya to grab his hips and pull him close.
何やってるんだよ、離せ。
いろいろ知ってるよ。調べたからね。幼児の過去のこととかもさ。
His past? Why would Zenya care about that?
だからさ、仲良くしようよ。
やだ、離せよ。
Yuji struggled wildly to escape. And then, all of a sudden, Zenya froze. Yuji looked up and gasped at what he saw. Zenya was rooted to the spot, his arms twisted behind his back. Turning his head as far as it would go, he shot a furious glare over his shoulder. Meanwhile, Yuji struggled to process what he was seeing. Tetsuo was restraining Zenya.
離せ！
No. Zenya screamed, whipping his arm free. He backed away from Tetsuo. Tetsuo stood there silently as usual. His expression was blank. No, wait. Something was different. Tetsuo was soaked from head to toe, but Yuji thought he could see a faint light in his eyes. Was it a trick of the rain? For some reason, he got the sense that Tetsuo was angry.
白には鉄を。
Zenya's attitude had changed completely. He glared at Tetsuo with such naked fury, Yuji half expected him to start hissing like a cat.
なんでお前がここに来るんだよ。触るな。
Tetsuo's growl cut through the rain.
それに触るな。
ああ？
勝手に触るな。
At this, Zenya's jaw dropped. He shot a quick glance at Yuji.
何？それとか言っちゃってさ。幼児は俺のもの宣言。
Have you not seen what we've been doing? Zenya stared at the sodden ground. Strange sounds bubbling from the back of his throat, and his shoulders began to shake.
何それ？何それ？何なんだよそれ！
He looked up, throwing his arms wide.
ふざけてんのか？いい加減にしろよ。調子乗りやがって。誰がお前のものなんだよ。ただの人間のくせにさ。ほんと。お前、生意気なんだよ。
Zenya's smile had vanished.
だったら、お前に何ができる？
Tetsuo finally spoke, his voice low.
何ができるんだよ。
Did he smack you? Even as the world blurred around them, Tetsuo never faded out of focus. He was the same way in class too. He never tried to draw attention to himself, yet somehow, he was impossible to ignore.
ふざけんな。
Zenya whispered, his head tilted at an unnatural angle.
なんでさ、そんなに偉そうなの？お前、偉いの？何ができる？だって？何が？ じゃあ、お前こそ何ができるんだよ。そもそもお前、何なのわけわかんねえんだよ。俺はお前みたいなやつ、大っ嫌いなんだよ。幼児の周りうろちょろしてさ。で、お前は何ができんの？答えろよ。あ？1秒以内に答えろ！
Yuji watched their confrontation with growing confusion. It seemed that Tetsuo and Zenya weren't working together after all. There was genuine hate in Zenya's bloodshot eye.
答えられないなら消えろ！今すぐ！
Screaming, Zenya lunged at Tetsuo. He just bitch smacked him. Please tell me that's all he did. But froze. His left eye opened wide. Oh my god, he did. He just smacked him. Like the little bitch Zenya is. Zenya groaned and backed away. All of a sudden, he howled in agony, his body shaking. He staggered off toward the main gate. What was that? Yuji stared after him in disbelief. Then he realized that he could hear bells in the distance. That word. He recalled Makoto mentioning a connection between Zenya and that song. It seemed that was more than just a rumor after all. Zenya disappeared into the rain, his footsteps splashing as he went. His pained cries soon faded entirely. Yuji had no idea how to react. He simply stood there, his mind blank. He could feel a chill creeping up his leg and realized that his fingers were half numb with cold. He'd been standing in the rain for far too long. The chill brought him back to reality. Tetsuo? He turned to find his sharp eyes staring into him. He knew he would be grateful for Tetsuo's rescue, but Yuji couldn't help but be wary around the larger man.
どうしてここに？沖永とお前が話しているのを見た。
Had he seen their little exchange by the lockers?
なんでわざわざ？
Because the last time he beat the crap out of you? As he spoke, Yuji took a step back. Tetsuo was staring at him silently like always. Yet something felt different. He couldn't put his finger on what exactly, but he began to feel increasingly unsafe. Tetsuo stepped forward. The downpour was a roar now, filling Yuji's ears. He needed to run, not just from Zenya, but from Tetsuo too. With that thought, Yuji darted to the side. But Tetsuo closed the distance between them and swiftly grabbed his arm. Just like that, he yanked Yuji back and forced him up against the campus wall. The concrete scraped his cheek and he felt Tetsuo's body heat envelop him from behind.
やめろよ白沼
His protests were wasted. He knew Tetsuo wouldn't listen. But he had to say something, or the terror would overwhelm him. No means no. Or in this case, yes. Tetsuo placed a hand against the wall, trapping Yuji between his body and the concrete. Yuji could feel Tetsuo's warm breath on the back of his neck. Its touch seemed to set the skin in flame. Then Tetsuo grabbed his chin with his free hand, forcing him to turn his head. Next thing he knew, he felt something wet touch his neck, and it wasn't the rain. It was Tetsuo's tongue. Slowly it trailed down his neck to his shoulder. A shudder shot down his spine, a mixture of disgust, terror, and something else entirely. He sucked in a breath, bracing himself. Just then, the wet sensation vanished, and he felt a sharp pain on his neck. Did Tetsuo bite him? Was his lip still on Yuji's neck? Tetsuo released his hold on his chin. He used his free hand to yank up Yuji's vest and shirt, then roughly pawed at his stomach. His fingers were cold and damp from the rain.
やだ白沼
Yuji protested, but his voice cracked, turning his demand into a desperate plea. He hated himself for sounding so pathetic. This was not the first time Tetsuo had made him feel so powerless. Would it happen all over again? Didn't Tetsuo ever tire of breaking him? Then something occurred to him. Was he trying to use Yuji like a woman? Maybe he'd grown tired of the real thing and was looking for a new toy to play with? That had to be it. Nothing else made sense. And with that thought, a dam burst, unleashing a torrent of rage and shame.
俺を女の代わりにするな。
About damn time, dude. He tried to punch the wall, but Tetsuo's hand shot up to catch his fist.
なんなんだよ。なんでこんなことするんだよ。普通の相手は飽きたってことか。俺がお前に何したって言うんだよ。なんでお前のいいようにされなきゃならないんだよ。いい加減にしてくれよ。もううんざりだ。頼むから。もうやめてくれ。
Words poured from his lips and were carried off by the rain. He couldn't have stopped himself even if he wanted to. At the end, Yuji felt his throat hitch in a sob. He didn't care what happened now. Maybe Tetsuo would beat him to a pulp. It didn't matter. He just wanted it to be over. He stood there with bated breath, waiting for an answer. But then he felt Tetsuo's lips on his neck again, a soft brush like a faintest of kisses. Or maybe like a massage.
そんなこと。
His whisper made Yuji inhale sharply. He smelled something overpoweringly sweet. It was the same scent that always filled the air around Tetsuo. Today it was stronger than ever. But it didn't turn his stomach the way cheap cologne would. Instead, it seemed to penetrate Yuji's very bone and creep into his mind like a fog. I know. What did Tetsuo mean? He tried to think, but the fragrance had him. As his mind grew clouded, his heart began to race. He could feel a strange ache building in his chest. Something was different about Tetsuo today. Those times he manhandled Yuji before, all Yuji had sensed from him was a cold, mechanical sense of purpose. This time, however, it felt different, almost like Tetsuo wanted him. As he continued to, sensing its familiar warmth, he realized that it was Tetsuo's hand. His bony fingers tousled Yuji's hair. Then the warmth was gone again, and Tetsuo walked off into the dreary gray evening. All that remained now was the pattering of rain. Yuji pulled away from the wall, got dressed, and picked up his book bag off the ground. After being forgotten in the rain for so long, it was sodden and heavy. Right as he started to walk to kick the mud from his shoe, however, his bag suddenly began to vibrate. It was his phone. Quickly, he dug it out from his bag and looked at the screen. It was an email from his sister. He quickly opened it. Okay. It happened. Just gave birth to a healthy baby boy. His nephew... Yeah, there is a weird delay. His nephew had made it into this world safe and sound. And yet, for some reason, he felt like crying. He was so happy. Or at least he should have been. So why did he feel so sad? In that moment, Yuji found himself missing the very body heat he had so despised. Kinky. And that's where we're gonna leave it. So thank you guys so much for joining me and watching this. You guys are all so very, very awesome. Please let me know in the comment section, what do you guys think of this game? And do you want to see more horror visual novels like this? Because I'd love to bring you lots more. Alright guys, have a fantastic day. Let me know in the comments what games you guys would want to see me play next. And here's a hint to our next Let's Play after we finish this one. And after we finish Lila's Curse. Vampire Yuri. Bye guys. Good luck guessing.